Okay, well, I always like to begin these public presentations by acknowledging and saying thank you to those people who have made all this possible. And I started making a list, Joe and Sharon, and then I looked over and I saw the people from Warrnambool, Cassandra and Iona, and then I saw the people from Ballarat, Simone, Donna. I realised that rather than singling out a few people, I'd like to say thank you to everyone here in the room, and I'd like you all to acknowledge each other for that. So I'd like to give you each other a round of applause for being here and doing the work you're doing. So I think the conversation we're having here today is incredibly significant. It's a conversation which not too long ago was not possible in this country, and I think it is worth us noting that fact. I'd like to also say something about this work because most of us here, not all, but most of us here will be involved in this work, not for just professional reasons, but for personal reasons. And people sometimes find this striking. I'm 2 metres tall and better part of 140 kilos, yet my life has been touched, damaged and disrupted by family violence. My mother in particular was a survivor of intense family violence. So I think it's important that I acknowledge that from the start rather than hide with some kind of professional edifice. It's about people and it's about real life and it's about context and it's about what it's like to live in these settings. So I just want to acknowledge some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are difficult. It's hard for me to talk about them sometimes. So let's make sure that if we are activated or triggered in any way that we make sure we take time and reach out to the staff here in the orange shirts to support you. So let me begin in earnest. I've thought very seriously about what to come here and say to you today. Well, the challenge for me is always to try and say something meaningful and to strike a balance between what it is I'd like to say and what it is you might be interested in hearing. So I looked at the other speakers today, all of whom are amazing women and true experts in their respective fields, and I asked myself, what could I possibly say that might be of interest to you here today? I'm not an expert in family violence. My expertise is in the treatment of trauma and thinking around trauma, which obviously intersects into that region. But we have here today two world-leading academics and professors. There is nothing that I can say that they do not know a million times better. So I reflected on what I've been lucky enough to be involved in as part of the Shrewd Initiative. I've spoken a great deal around the regional centres, and my role has really been on educating staff in hospitals, from doctors to managers, on the intersection between the psychology of trauma and family violence. And the constant struggle here is always to try and find some kind of utility for the audience. Obviously, speaking to doctors is different to speaking to managers. Thus far, that utility is always centred on clinical applications and drawing upon my clinical expertise. Yet when I was thinking about the audience here today, when I was thinking about you, I was left with the sense that an address like that would be a waste of time. All of you are leaders in your fields. You're all out there doing this. You know these things intimately. As a result, I've decided to leave the matter of facts and information and data to the prestigious professors that we've been lucky enough to hear from today and will hear from later on. And so in some ways I've chosen to share with you something which has been reflexively shaped from the content of the other speakers. I'm going to draw on my training as both a clinician but also as a philosopher. I have a PhD in psychiatry, but I also have a PhD in philosophy. And the intersecting point for that work is on the relationships or the interiorities of violence. So I'm going to focus on subjectivities of trauma and family violence and the dynamics of dealing with these subjectivities. In this sense, I'm asking questions about what the individual has been subjected to and subjugated by, because subjectivities are always formed in certain contexts. I'm seeking to describe rather than explain these dynamics, because when I think about physical abuse, I can't help but feel that factual knowledge cannot prepare us for what physical abuse does to a person. And if I can help reveal the interior qualities of those kinds of experiences, then I think that would be a good way for us to spend our time together today. But to do this, I shall have to speak of things which I cannot speak. Family violence in Australia has suffered from a profound form of social neglect. Like so much which is traumatic, it is relegated and hidden. A neglect that is redressed through programs like the Shrew and international movements like Me Too. Yet conspiracies of silence still abound. The broader understandings of violence, in particular violence which is directed at women, is still woefully incomplete and undocumented, ununderstood and unrecognised, particularly in the broader social and media environments. Yet just as trauma on a personal level erupts through psychic defences of the victim, so too does collective and social trauma. That which has been denied a place in social memory and narrative has a tendency, I think, to erupt into social discourse as a private shared category of experience slumbers in need of voice and of ears. Me Too, in some sense, is the quintessential example of this, whereby a multitude of silent personal trauma erupted into collective consciousness. Family violence in Australia, while slowest to awaken, is nonetheless beginning to emerge into our social discourse, emerging from the private and hidden spaces of closed doors and broken bodies into a public discourse about violence and power, in particular examining the sovereignty and autonomy of female bodies and women's rights to feel safe in our society. So a summation of my message today might be this. Let us not forget that human autonomy is always contingent on respect for that autonomy. And let us not forget what and who is rendered silent in contexts where individual autonomy has been violated. In this sense, I'm really hoping to remind us of the nature of subjectivity itself. Trauma. I will start with a simple axiomatic statement. Family violence is traumatic. But what does this mean? Today, when we speak of trauma, we speak of a profound shock, a disruption to one's sense of identity and subjectivity through witnessing or being involved in acts of terrible violence. These acts somehow disrupt our sense of ourselves, but also our sense of the world. Yet critically, there is also a social dimension to trauma, which represents a collective relationship to what is said and what is heard. This intersection between the personal and the social, as well as the influence these have on subjectivities, will be a central concern I would like to address today. Personal trauma is often what we focus on when we deal with trauma in a clinical setting or, for that matter, in institutions. Yet the focus on the personal is the result, I think, of a profound misconception about human agency, an error which human situations like family violence profoundly highlight. Personal trauma affects the psychological, the emotional, as well as the biological constitution of the individual. Yet it also reverberates through social settings, into the worlds of the other, into social relations, and importantly into institutions, often hidden and concealed. This is because the interpersonal is by definition a social event. Thus I really want to explore how family violence and trauma affect both our speaking and our hearing of human catastrophe, and how this intersects with agency and autonomy as a means for offering us insight and sensitivity to all that we do. When we speak of trauma, we tend to break the experience into the categories of what might simply be referred to as trauma of omission or trauma of commission. Trauma by commission is generated by acts which are done against or to a person or are witnessed. The most notable of these kind of interpersonal variants of trauma of commission are sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic or interpersonal violence, and the witnessing of these kinds of events. Now, this is essentially the focus or the main manifestation of trauma in a family violence setting, yet it is not the only one. The second broad category is trauma of omission, and this tends to be descriptive of trauma that is associated with early life process. And this trauma is traumatic because it disrupts the child's formation of a sense of what the world is like and who they are, because that is always done primarily through relationships. This mode of trauma is also frequent in family violence settings and is often a secondary result of receiving parenting from traumatised people. We might do well to remember that the essence of traumatic experience is being afraid and being alone. We are always haunted by safety. No matter the type of experience, trauma is always due in some ways to an intensity of experience that cannot be experienced. But what do I mean by this? Well, it significantly alters the process of encoding and storing information as memory in particular, which affects and fractures memory formation and consolidation. Thus, the processes of symbolisation, mentalisation, mental representation and narrative are disrupted and in extreme cases stop. The mind of the traumatised person itself becomes disrupted. The person is disrupted. Thus the very foundations of self and agency can collapse in the most profound forms of trauma. And I'll speak to this as we move through. The net effect of these types of events is catastrophic to the organisation of the victim as a person. This is something which is not well grasped or understood, but it's going to be the focus of what I'm speaking about today. The type of brutality which sits at the core of family violence is just the kind of brutality which disrupts people in the most profound ways. And a sad and little acknowledged fact in the broader public, but which we are all aware of in this room, is that the damage from such experiences haunts survivors of extreme violence in the deepest layers of their mind, often for their entire lives. No matter what happens to the perpetrator, these haunting qualities profoundly influence the relational field of victims, and this is something we should never, ever forget. Kathy Karath says this: trauma is not locatable in the simple, violent or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way its very unassimilated nature is, the way it was precisely not known in the first instance. It returns to the survivor later on. Trauma seems to be much more than a pathology or a simple illness of a wounded psyche. It's always the story of a wound that cries out, that addresses us in the attempt to tell us of a reality or of a truth that is not otherwise available. Trauma, in this sense, freezes experience into an eternal present. In this sense, trauma has a horizon that never collapses into the past. And so trauma and traumatised people actually live in a different way and in a different kind of world to untraumatised people. The traumatised person in some ways takes on a different mode of being, a mode of being that often feels disorganised and broken, whereby the ability and agency of that person to form new horizons for themselves and to take new ways of being is profoundly compromised. Much of what has been written on trauma has described trauma as the unimaginable, the unknowable, and the unsayable. And I'll explore these themes as I progress. Yet it's important to realise that traumatic events and behaviours that cause them are in actual fact something which is inherently imaginable. Because the simple truth is that the generation of trauma is usually the product of contact with other people's dark imaginings, and the experiential consequence of those imaginings is what you all work with and see. When people say it is unimaginable, I think it's a kind of code for I don't want to imagine that. Ironically, it is this very lack of imagination which not only silences traumatic experiences, but in the worst cases it subsumes them through claims that this knowledge is unintelligible or unknowable. And therefore, the victim's experience is immediately foreclosed. People often claim to understand traumatic experience while sitting in the comfortable position of their own perspective. This, sadly, is frequently the case with family violence and family violence settings, and I'm sure all of you here have met and come up across these kinds of perspectives. Tragically, much of the social consequence and consciousness of those unaffected by such horror imagines family violence as some kind of strange and sterile stereotype, where violence is just not that bad, rather than grasping that family violence in some sense is a euphemism for various acts of barbarism, rape and murder. And I have no doubt that many of you here have sat, worked and held people in these environments. And I might add that this is why trauma workers such as yourselves need so much support to avoid vicarious traumatisation. These types of failure of imagination, I think, are the most dangerous kinds of foreclosure, for they suggest that there is no problem. A policeman once said to me, "That doesn't happen in our community." Now you can laugh or you can cry, the choice is yours. But a statement like this exemplifies the point that I'm making. It is true that traumatised people and traumatised psyches can generate memories and experiences that possess the individual. It has them, they don't have it. This is in contrast to the so-called normal psyche, where events are processed by the individual as their own unique history and story and narrative. Trauma becomes understandable then as a kind of unbearable quality, whereby one's psychic state, one's ability to know and experience themselves and shape oneself is essentially removed. One's sense of authenticity and autonomy is compromised by the sheer force of one's encounter with horror, violence, and the blackness of the world. Thus, the everydayness for a traumatised person is anything but everyday in the mundane sense of that word. For in such a state, traumatised people generate a kind of affective rupture of the world that makes being in that world painful, agonising, and unbearable. Trauma becomes essentially inscribed upon the body, and trauma becomes inscribed and instilled into the bodies of victims. not just as wounds that are seen in the physical sense, but rather as somatic manifestations of their pain. Much has been written about trauma and how it essentially overshadows the emotional world of the individual and forms a region of loss within the individual's life world. That it is characterised by polarised responses of either affective blandness or overreactive and unregulated affective qualities. And I'm sure you have all seen two sides of that coin. This damage to the individual, however, I must reiterate, brings with it categories of loss which are essentially social in nature. Victims experience loss of innocence, the loss of love, the loss of the ability to relate. And as Dostoevsky reminds us, what is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love. And this, I think, is often the greatest tragedy that traumatised victims in family violence suffer from. A basic human right to feel loved and be loved. Trauma dramatically corrodes the sense of agency and personal interrelation of the individual. So the world itself becomes ruptured by trauma. Trauma, sadly, often remains voiceless and unheard within the individual and within the social setting, erupting perhaps as a symptom that is actually a symbol of a deeper and more contextually bound problem, something which must be undergone and worked through if that person is to regain and heal. The body, that side of all human happenings, is the repository for all that is not said and cannot be named in traumatised victims of family violence. And whilst the body always speaks in its quietude, expression can be limited or negated, and thus communicability itself breaks down. By extension of this, trauma cannot be named by the voiceless person often. And in removing voice, so often in trauma we see negation of one's identity, one's individuality, even to the point that one becomes a thing to the other, and even sometimes to themselves. And this pattern perpetuates violence. Trauma thus robs people of their interiority and autonomy. This brings me to my central point for today. The ideas of autonomy and self-sovereignty are deeply embedded in the prevalent ideas about our society and individuals within that society. We live in a world which believes absolutely in individual autonomous action and power. We live in a world of privileged autonomy. Yet I want to say to you that this world of agency is far more fragile than we've been led to believe. The cult of individual agency in our society is a problematic one. This idea severely delimits what we can really know about autonomy, particularly in contexts as extreme as family violence. Autonomy, whilst being a real possibility for human life, is in fact incredibly fragile. A fragility which is dependent upon a social contract which respects the individual mind and body of all persons. To not recognise this fragility is to essentially fail to comprehend how selves are both formed and destroyed by social relationships. Subjects are formed on the basis of what individuals are subjected to. I wish then to invoke the great exemplar of this misunderstanding about human autonomy, one that we've all so frequently heard when working in these contexts, namely, why doesn't she just leave? Now, we would probably all answer this question first with facts, after we slap our heads and shake our heads in disbelief that we're having this conversation again. But after that, you'd probably answer with facts, like it's the most likely time for her to be killed. Or we might reverse the position and say, why is it the responsibility of the victim to leave? Perhaps their partner should not think it's okay to violate their basic human rights. All of these are great answers, and they're absolutely true. Yet what I'm suggesting to you today is that this statement carries more with it. We can learn more from it. The woman who, in the family violence setting, is not able to leave, I think is partially due to the fact that she lives in a world where her individual sovereignty is not upheld. And this sovereignty is, in fact, completely undermined. And the strength of that corrosion is hard for many people who live in an autonomous world of sovereignty to really understand. What it's like to be controlled in every single way, to be kept in a cupboard, to have your finances controlled, to be tracked every movement of every day. Hard to understand. You see, the statement, "Why doesn't she just leave?" brings with it implicit assumptions about individual agency, which are simply often untrue in family violence settings. When a woman is living in a context of threatened violence, then her autonomy cannot be taken for granted, as it is by so many in our society. The net effect of this is a profound corroding of her very sense of self and what is possible for her. In this sense, we must realise that it is not only our choices that make us who and what we are, but it is also the choices we cannot make and the choices that others make that also form us. We must not forget that each of us is built on the rocky ground of human relations in all its forms. In short, autonomy and liberty can only mean something in situations where they are respected, upheld and protected. Human life always relies on a kind of cooperative world, and when this cooperative space breaks down, the individual's autonomy also breaks down. And it is this which I feel is often not understood in circumstances of extreme power and control. Institutional abuse, cults, torture victims, and in that exact same category of horrendous experiences, we find family violence as manifestations where human agency itself is under attack and undermined. To unpack this further for our discussion today in a family violence setting, exactly what is not respected in one's individual autonomy is both body and being. What this means is that in a family violence setting, the moral universe for those trapped within it is profoundly different to the universe of people living in a world where the individual experiences sovereignty and boundaries as an everyday matter. We must, I think, remember that the most severe trauma victims have in some sense been authored by violence. I think this is possibly an explanation for the failure of comprehension and imagination demonstrated by statements like, "Why doesn't she just leave?" This failure of comprehension is also, I think, embedded in many of the institutions of our society. And these institutions are built on the same assumptions of autonomy and from the same moral universe where self-authorship is an unquestioned quality of human life. This is a point perhaps best seen in our legal and policing systems. As Judith Herman states, the wishes and needs of victims are often diametrically opposed to the requirements of legal proceedings. Now, this is not the fault of any institution. I'm certainly not wishing to demean the important work these institutions do. Rather, I'm seeking to highlight that all institutions are circumscribed by limitation. All have scope, and by necessity this means limitation. Yet in bringing these limitations to conscious awareness, we can perhaps look to other institutions to provide what structures like our legal judicial system simply can't. What I'm suggesting to you all here today is that hospitals as institutions at the front line of family violence have a critical role to play. Hospitals are ideally institutions built on deep precepts of care. Thus, I think hospitals are the perfect space to incorporate an understanding of the fact that social normative assumptions of agency and family violence are often mutually exclusive spaces, and in knowing this, we must instead attend to people and exercise a certain kind of relational generosity. Being an intersubject, being a person amongst persons, means being sensitised to the mutual fragility of all of us as people. What we are essentially in need of, I think, is more emphasis on the work I know you are all already doing, on re-establishing the basic human dignity and autonomy of victims of family violence. Understanding that this begins in safety and moves to re-establishing a world of shared respect and agency, a world where one's personal autonomy and bodily presence will be protected by a community which realises just how fragile all of us are. For me, the axis that all this revolves around is the matter of communicability. The most obvious result of all the catastrophes I've discussed today is that victims become voiceless or unheard. To illustrate this question of voice and communicability, I'd like to share a brief vignette of a woman I've worked with who exemplifies some of the concerns from today. This is the case of Sophia. For those of you who don't know, Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. This is obviously not her real name, but she has a great deal to teach us, hence the name I've chosen. Sophia is a 40-year-old woman. She was born in South America. She was referred to me as I specialise in the treatment of trauma. Her early childhood was described as highly abusive. She described herself as a neglected and introverted child. Her father was physically abusive and her mother was emotionally absent and neglectful. Sophia was hospitalised in early childhood with abdominal injuries from a physical assault perpetrated by her father. She had ruptured internal organs. Her mother did not protect her. Her memory of sexual trauma and violence is distant. Sophia lived with her grandma in her teenage years. In her late teens, she married a man who physically abused her. He died, some might say thankfully. And she, in her late 20s, again married a man who was emotionally, psychologically, and physically abusive. This marriage ended in divorce. Sophia recounts that during this time and throughout the subsequent years, she raised her daughter as a single mother. This was a difficult time for her. After her second marriage ended, she felt shut down. She described a kind of block on the inside which was trapped and could not escape. At this time, Sophia also began to experience strong depressive symptoms and found it difficult to actively express. This reduction in affective expression appeared particularly in complex expressive acts like writing and speaking. So Sophia's presentation was for what is known as selective mutism. She had lost the ability to speak, not as a willful act, since she was choosing not to speak, but rather she wanted to speak and she could not. She had lost her words in her language. She reported feeling choked. She reported being unable to speak or engage and felt very scared in social interactions. The severity of her symptoms developed over time. However, Sophia lost the ability to express and communicate at all. This freezing up of the inside meant she lost her job and she was completely socially isolated. This case has been one I've carried with me for a long time and I've thought about very deeply. Now, I've chosen to share the case of Sophia because what we see in her presentation is not a figurative sense of one losing the ability to communicate or the loss of individual autonomy, but rather this is a literal process. She has literally lost the ability to communicate. She has literally lost an internal sense of autonomy due to the barbarism she's been faced with. Thus, a key focus in working with victims of such abuse is the need to let suffering speak. Because what we can very clearly see is that agency is always directed and connected to speaking and being heard, finding a voice. So what does it look like to really understand the damage that the violence of Sophia's life has caused her sense of self and agency? Sophia, like all of us, occupies a unique field of experience that is fundamentally her own. This fact demands that she, like all of us, need to reach out to a collective and shared world. For it is in this sharing that we establish our sense of self and autonomy. Through our relations with others, we are formed. Reflexively, we develop. This can only happen, though, as I've said, in a shared state of respect, care, and love. Yet for Sophia, the world has not provided reciprocal safety. The consequences for Sophia of living in a world where her autonomy and agency has not been treated with basic human tenderness is that her sense of agency was circumvented, or at least corrupted. Because autonomy, I must say, only emerges from a world where it is treasured and defended. Here the question of speech, in the case of Sophia, comes to the fore, as language is that mediating process which allows her to have a sense of self that relates to others. Possibility and autonomy are the very things which Sophia has lost primary access to. For Sophia, her lack of language, agency and relationship emerged from the lack of the fragile, elementary communications and intimacies of her early life. As such, her sense of self is built upon a foundation of hostility, lack and violence. It then follows, I think, in the case of Sophia, that her disruption of speech and language is not just the disruption of words, but it is the disruption of the world. It is a kind of eviction from the world, an eviction from her sense of bodily presence in that world. She has, in some sense, regressed into a diminished and hollow sense of self. This has left her in a primal state of devastation. For Sophia, to be in this world meant to be in neglect and violence. Now, speech would enable Sophia to be in relationship, but one must ask, why would she wish to be in relationship, where the defining experience of all her relationships is a reciprocity of violence? It is important here, I think, to remember that when we're dealing with trauma and family violence, we are dealing with those who are unheard. Sophia's mutism brought with it a strange kind of safety, a way of being out of language and out of the social world in which people hurt her. Language is the social is people, and for Sophia, people are violent. Yet this eviction led to further problems of relation in her speechlessness. This meant she was unable to establish need and unable to establish boundaries between herself and others, and this seemed to further cement her experience of the world as uncaring and as unsafe. And how many times have we seen just this story? The girl who was victimised as a child, whose sense of self and agency was corroded, grows into a woman who carries the scars of such violence in her sense of self because her agency and autonomy could only have grown in a place where these things were attended to. Sadly for Sophia, the one thing that she really needs is the very thing she has never had. She's never had a place to speak. She's never had a place which is safe. The task of psychotherapy and support services for women in these settings, I suggest, is to restructure and repair the fundamental damage which is done by living in a world like this. In Sophia's case, the violence and disorganisation of the world have been transferred from her relational network into her mind and into her body. Her capacity for speech in the normal sense is ruptured, which demonstrates not just a rupture of psychological organisation, but it is a rupture to the relational world itself. And here, if we listen closely, we can hear what Sophia's suffering is saying. She needs a world of tenderness, a world where her autonomy and agency is respected, upheld, and protected by those around her. This tells us how to treat those who are suffering the effects of trauma and family violence, as well as giving us a basic blueprint on how to treat all people. We must establish a deep sense of security and autonomy, for it is the only way, and is only in those settings where a person is able to say the unsayable, where they can be heard in their silence. And it is only in being heard and held that people who have been hurt in this way can heal. Because, as I'm fond of saying, hope always clings to a transfigured body. This case, I think, highlights my key themes for today, and it is my hope that what I've said today will remind us about subjectivities. Let us not forget that human autonomy is always contingent on respect for that autonomy, and let us not forget what and who is rendered silent in contexts where autonomy has been violated. I want to end today by affirming the work that you all do. Each and every person here today is in direct service and taking direct action on these themes, because each and every one of you is seeking to create a world where human tenderness, respect and sovereignty are upheld as essential qualities for human dignity. And it's only through people taking this action that we have any hope of a world which is not overrun by our brute and apish natures, where power and control and barbarism are orders of the day. We must resist those forces with tenderness and compassion wherever we can. So, my only coloured slide for today. I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for your time. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for your care. The world needs as much of this as it can muster. So thank you.